Morning, everybody. You've heard of the Beatles? Well, it was on this date in 1964, February 1, that their song, I Want to Hold Your Hand, hit number 1 in the charts in the United States. Here's Alan Freed, disc jockey in Cleveland, and he coined the phrase rock and roll in the early 1950s. Technologically, a big breakthrough was the 45 RPM record, the single. And kids had record players and they could buy these singles. And if you look carefully at this single, it's by Elvis Presley. So here's Elvis in Memphis. Sam Phillips on the right had Sun Records. And Sam Phillips was interested in records of all over the place, blues, country, hillbilly, gospel. And eventually Bill Haley and the Comets did Rock Around the Clock. Many people consider this to be the first real rock and roll record. There's a lot of debate about that. Others during that time period, Buddy Holly, here's Little Richard, Wild and Crazy, Full of Energy. But all these different types of music were coming together to form rock and roll. Now here's Liverpool. Here's where the Beatles were from. Liverpool was a port city, had a lot of trade with the United States, and merchant ships would pull in and they would have American records. And British kids got wind of these records and they started listening to them. And they adapted American rock and roll to something called skiffle. Here's Lonnie Donegan, who was a big skiffle player. You picked up your guitar and you did some basic chords, and that's how John Lennon and the Beatles got started, as skiffle players. So here they are as teenagers, George on the left, John in the middle, Paul on the right, and they were skiffle players. Their first group was known as the Quarrymen, after the high school that was local. And they played in a lot of clubs in Liverpool. The Cavern was one of the clubs, and they played a lot and they got really good. They got really tight. But after a while, they wanted to do something a little bit different, and they went down to Germany. And here they are in a club in Hamburg. And they were here in the early 1960s, played different clubs over time, but played and played and played and got really good and really tight. And if you look at these faces here, you will not see Ringo. Ringo is going to join later. So the Beatles came back to England, and their first contract was with Polydor to be backup to Tony Sheridan. And in this song, My Bonnie, they are referred to as the Beat Brothers. So they were a backup band at first. Well, in 1961, they met Brian Epstein on the right. Brian became their manager. He was able to get them some contacts in the industry. He also said, you guys got to dress up a bit so you don't look too sloppy on stage. And then a second key person in the Beatles' development was George Martin. You can see him sitting in the background here, but he was their producer. He produced their great records. He was looking for a hit for them, and the best thing that he thought they had was this one, Please Please Me. This debuted in February of 1963. It made it to 18 on the charts in the UK, and he kept pushing them to come up with more songs, and they did. In 1963, they're on the British show Saturday Night Live at the Palladium, pictured here. This was the largest variety show in the UK. And as they're touring, their fame begins to spread, and a newspaper coins the term Beatlemania. And this is one of the things we associate it with, screaming girls and the police having to keep the crowd back from the band. They actually used water hoses in some places to keep the crowds back. Now, Capitol Records, here's a picture of the record. They were part of the EMI group, which had the Beatles contract, and they weren't that interested in the record. But eventually, they played it, it caught on, and our event, February 1, 1964, you can see here, number 1 in the Billboard Hot 100, I Want to Hold Your Hand. And this is a real breakthrough for a British band to get this in the U.S. And even Mick Jagger acknowledged that the Beatles were crucial to the British breakthrough. And here they are a week later, February 7, they landed at JFK. DJs had told the kids to skip school. You can see them up on the viewing deck, and the British invasion had begun.